There is one question in life that's more important than any other for us to answer. That is the question of who Jesus is. We've been thinking about that for a few weeks now, thinking about what Jesus taught about himself. This week, we look at a passage where he himself asks that of his own disciples. And we see, not just in their answer, but in their misunderstanding and in what he says about himself in response to it, what difference it makes to know Jesus as who he really is and in terms of what he really had to come and do. Hello and welcome to this week's video from Knightswood United Free Church in Glasgow. My name's Sam, and we're carrying on this week in a series that talks about Jesus in his own words. What did he say about himself? And this week, the passage is an absolutely key one from the Gospel of Mark. Before it, in the story about Jesus and what he came to do and to teach, the disciples are discovering who he is. They're discovering that he's the Messiah, that he's God's chosen king. And it's in this passage that they finally get that. But it's also in this passage that the second half of the Gospel begins, where we discover what that actually means. What will it be like for Jesus to be the Messiah? And it's in this passage we discover for the first time, and the disciples discover the first time, what Easter will be. As Jesus says, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. For the first time he tells them he must suffer, he must be rejected, and he must die. That's his mission, and that is why he came. Our passage begins with Jesus taking his disciples away for a bit of a breather. And on the way he has a discussion with them. He is encouraging them, pushing them to see the reality of who they're with. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. So here we see Jesus starts with the easy question. Who do other people say that I am? And the answers people are giving aren't bad, actually. A prophet, John the Baptist even, or even the great prophet Elijah. These are some of the great figures from Israel's history. You know, they're saying, God is really at work in this man. There's something really special going on. He's up there with the great prophets. But at the same time, these are all people from the past. And they're all people whose job it was to prepare the way for God's Messiah. And Jesus therefore asks, who do you say that I am? What about you? In other words, they haven't quite got it. And more than that, I don't want this just to be an armchair discussion. I want to know what you say, what you think. Peter, inspired by the Holy Spirit, says, you are the Messiah. You are the Christ. In other words, you are God's chosen one. You're his king. You're the one who will rule always, the one who will put all things right, the one we've been waiting for, the one who brings God's true hope of a world made new. And Jesus says, don't tell anyone about me. And when we hear that, we want to think, why? Well, what's Jesus saying? Why does that make sense? A few chapters back, he was sending out Peter and the other apostles to preach about him and about his message. And now that they actually understand it, now that they get it, he says, don't tell anyone. And the answer, of course, is actually in the very verses that follow. They don't get it. They get that Jesus is the Messiah, yes, sure, but they don't have any idea what that will involve. They know perhaps what the destination is, they have no clue about what the journey there will be like. And it was a hard road ahead. And that's what we see in the next section. Now, as soon as Peter gets it, Jesus begins to explain what it really means for him to be the Messiah, what he has to do to fulfill his role and his purpose. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus turned and looked at his disciples and rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So 3 things were going to happen. He had to suffer, he had to be rejected, and he had to die. He would suffer, and we have to remember always that didn't merely mean suffering on the cross, but as the prophet Isaiah put it, he would be a man of suffering and acquainted with grief. His whole life was full of rejection and pain and struggle. And then he'd be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law. In other words, all the authorities. The elders, who are the secular leaders, the politicians, the chief priests, who were the religious leaders, and the teachers of the law, who were the academics, the experts, and often the people who took the Bible most seriously. All of them needed to reject Jesus. They'd test him, and they did, didn't they, again and again. And then finally in that great trial, they tested him, or the day before he died. And they said, "No, this one doesn't pass our scrutiny. This is not what a Messiah should be. He's not the one. This is not him. This is a blasphemer. And he must die." Finally, he must be killed, and then after 3 days rise again. His mission meant that he had to die, and without it, it would be worthless. He would teach them over the next while why he had to do that, why sin is so serious that it needed his death to make a way for people to come back to God. But if he didn't do it, he would be useless as a Messiah. To be the Messiah is to be the Son of Man who comes, who suffers, who is rejected, and who dies. Who is rejected by the very authorities who have failed people over the centuries, who are unable to rescue people on their own. And he will die, but he'll also rise again. And until the day he rises again, there will seem to be nothing strong, nothing impressive, nothing but weakness and failure in this Messiah. There'll be no sign of strength or of victory. There'll be no sign of blooming hope. There'll just be suffering. And no wonder Peter is shocked. No wonder he grabs Jesus and takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. Peter, we're often shocked at what he does. Telling Jesus off doesn't seem sensible, and it's not. But of course, we have to remember all the times that we in our lives have said to God that we think he's not running our lives quite the way we think he should. Made a few suggestions to him for a better way, a way with less suffering very often. And Jesus here gives the strongest rebuke he does anywhere in any of the Gospels. Jesus was not gentle with those who endangered other people's souls. He was not gentle with the Pharisees, especially. He called them, serpents and whitewashed tombs, blind guides. But he never said anything like this to them. "Get behind me, Satan." He's saying to Peter, when you think this way, with human concerns and not the concerns of God, you're thinking about human comfort, not God's promises, not God's ways, and that is ultimately demonic. Because if I was to listen to you, if I was to put aside my mission to accept the comfort that I deserve, the success, the ease that I could have, everything would fail. And that would be playing into the hands of the devil himself, God's great enemy. He had to die. And of course, as we think about Easter over the next few weeks, we'll be thinking more about exactly why he had to die. But right from the beginning of his ministry, he was utterly adamant that he had to. This was what he came to do, to be rejected, to suffer and to die. Now Jesus immediately explained what it would mean to follow him if he is a Messiah like this, a suffering Messiah. Then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" In other words, whoever follows Jesus is to expect what he expected. We might not pay the price that he paid, but we walk the same way he did. And it's so easy to blunt these words, just to spiritualize them away, to talk as if taking up the cross just meant dealing with nothing more than a few little niggles or the struggles we have day to day. They can be a part of it, but he's talking about the cost of following him. And to take up a cross, it's to pick up an instrument of torture and death. He's saying, the rest of life you're going to be walking, dragging your electric chair behind you, with the hangman's noose slung over your shoulder. You're walking to the execution grounds with me, just like a condemned Roman prisoner did with their cross. As the German pastor Bonhoeffer said, he himself would be killed by the Nazis in the end after paying many other prices for a life of faithfulness to Jesus. He said, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And it's true. If we follow him, it will hurt. There will be a cost to it. We so often think that following Jesus will just make life easier. And there's no doubt that it will make it better. There will be joy and peace we didn't know otherwise. But it will not make it easier. There will be a cost. There will be suffering. And there will be struggle. We have to deny ourselves. To choose to live in ways that give things up for him. We need to be giving of our time, of our talents, whatever they are, and of our money for him and for the gospel. Not that this is the way we're saved, but this is the way of following in Jesus' footsteps. We have to be willing to step out and to risk rejection from friends and from relatives when we talk about Jesus, so that they will hear the gospel for his sake and for the gospel's. We have to be willing to be a little bit poorer, not to have maybe exactly the holidays we would wish or the comforts we enjoy, so that we can pay for missionary work and for gospel work and for the churches to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. We'll have to take our time, whether that's loving and serving our neighbours around us, or serving in the church, whether on a committee or in some other job, or fixing things around the church, anything that we do for his sake. We will be spending our time as well as our money. And of course, Jesus says it is worth absolutely everything. To pay any price is worth it. Because, after all, in God's upside-down kingdom, the way of death and of self-denial is the way to life. It's how the gospel spreads. It's how people become Christians. It's how the church grows. You know, a comfortable, easy life never led to growing churches. And when we are willing to give up ourselves, put ourselves to death and follow him, he says to us, whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. It's a promise. And it's better than anything else you could have. You know, you can be a millionaire with your choice of private islands and a butler to bring you a nice glass of wine while you sit in your private cinema. But if you don't have this, he says it's worthless. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it, he says, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? For Jesus to be the Messiah meant that he had to suffer. It also meant he had to be rejected, and it meant he had to die. And in a much smaller way, it means the same for us. But when we do, when we follow in his way, we're doing what leads to the growth of the gospel. And it gives us confidence in our own faith that it's real, that it's the real thing. Because we're following in Christ's way, in his footsteps. And it is utterly worthwhile. And when he comes in his Father's glory with his holy angels, then we will see that everything, every cost we pay, every ounce of suffering, every difficulty, even death itself, is worthwhile for him.